Hi, everybody. We're still a few minutes from getting started, but I see that you can hear me. I see some eyes moving. Is that right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great, great. Well, we'll take a few minutes and wait for everyone else to join us, and then we'll get started. Let's begin. I'm hoping that some other folks will join us since we're not at full capacity, but out of respect for your time, we should get started. Welcome. Um, Let me know if at any point you're having trouble hearing me or any issues. You're not hearing me. Okay. Is anybody else hearing me? Can you give me a thumbs up if you're hearing me? Okay. Let me know if the problem continues. And I should say that I am recording our sessions. I will post them for folks who, for whatever reason, want to go back or who aren't able to make it. I hope that's okay with everyone. If there's a problem with that, please let me know. I should say too that I don't require you to have your camera going during the meetings. If you, for whatever reason, need to keep it off, that's completely fine. But thank you all for having yours on right now. It's helpful, especially for the first day, to put faces with names. And I want to start by saying that I'm really grateful that you're taking this class. Thank you. I know that it's part of the degree plan. I know it's a requirement, but nonetheless, I still appreciate it. And I want to acknowledge the commitment that you're taking in enrolling in and doing the work of this class. It's a commitment and a sacrifice of time, of energy, of money. And I don't need to tell you that, but I want you to know that I acknowledge that. And I know that it's also a commitment that other people besides you may be taking as well to help you have this time to be here for our meetings and to have the time to do the work, especially during the pandemic. So I want you to know that I take that commitment, both yours and your loved one's commitment, very seriously. And I'm going to do everything that I can to make sure that this is a valuable and productive experience. We'll spend some time today discussing what I think a productive experience will look like. But as you'll see, there's going to be a lot of space in this class for you to define what that experience will look like, or sorry, what that productivity or what that value will look like for you. You don't need to have that articulated today. And in fact, it'll, I think, become clear over the weeks to come what that looks like. But I mentioned that, and I pair that with the idea that I take your commitment very seriously, to encourage you from the start to let me know how I can help, how I can assist, how I can support, how I can encourage you to do the work that you want to do, but sometimes we don't always know what that work looks like. I thought we would start by talking a little bit about what theory is in general. I'm going to move to a not very aesthetically pleasing set of slides here. I apologize for that. My mom, who for years worked as a graphic designer, would disown me if she saw this. But in the interest of transparency and disclosure, I should say that I do not have the time right now that I wish I had. I think that it's the case for all of us. I am trying to manage my job and my life with a 5-year-old. I don't have the childcare that I had before the pandemic, and so there are certain ways in which I would do different things differently if I had more time. And again, I say that to you so that I'm being transparent, but also to recognize that you're not going to be able to always, especially under COVID conditions, do and commit as much as you would like to. Anyway, all that being said, I want to think about what theory is, and I've got a few ideas here that I want to talk through, but I also very much want to hear from you all, because you have read theory, you have engaged with theory in other forms, whether you're aware of it or not, and I want to try to build through the opening weeks of the semester as many different definitions of theory as there are people in this class. So I gave myself an assignment this afternoon, essentially, like, what is theory? And I came up with my definition. And I'd like you, I'm not going to ask you to do this explicitly, but I'd like you to try over the course of the semester to ask yourself this question: what is theory? What does it look like? What are its characteristics? Why is it something that some people value, and how can you use it? But anyway, so these are just some general ideas. Again, please let me know what you think about all this. I would love to hear folks jump in, and you can just raise your hand, you can just jump in, or type some stuff in the chat. And if there's something in the chat that I'm not seeing because of the shared screen mode, please just let me know. So one way of thinking about theory is to think about it as a form of criticism. And it's criticism that has as its target somewhat broad and ambitious goals. It tries to think about concepts and categories in literature, in art, in music, in film, in other forms of creative expression. And in that big picture, that broad scope, it thinks about how things have changed over time. What are some of the characteristics and commitments of various schools of thought or movements or time periods? And in many ways, how politics and ideology shape literary and artistic expression, as well as how literature and art can shape politics and ideology. A lot of what we're going to try to do over the course of this semester is define terms. And so as a way of modeling that, I want to try to define the two terms at the end of this statement. First is politics. And when I talk about politics in this class, I'm not only referring to the question of governance. I'm not only talking about electoral politics or who has political power, but rather how people decide to live with each other. So politics has to do with things such as voting and taxation and the military and other things that the government controls, but it also has to do with questions that, as I mentioned a second ago, have to do with how we live together. So education and gender roles and even something like sewage are all political issues because they are things that people determine and decide together, not always in ways that are equal, and in many ways, rarely in ways that are equal and distributed, but still it's a question of how people live together. Ideology has to do with the common sense or dominant ideas and modes and values and beliefs of a certain situation, a place, a location, a, a region, a state, an era. And ideology has to do with what people think is essentially normal and take for granted. So ideology has to do with political things, but it also has to do with things that aren't necessarily clearly political. And so theory, even though it targets the the creative world, is almost always invested in political and ideological questions. Again, both because theory presumes that artistic and other forms of creative expression reflects politics and ideology. It contains the politics and ideology of a time, but it also shapes the politics and ideology of the time. And so people who look at art are interested in art not just for art's sake, but because of what it can say about politics and ideology and how that changes. Now, in terms of what this looks like, in terms of other forms of criticism that you may have read in other classes or in other contexts, what differentiates theory from those other forms of criticism is that it is more ambitious and expansive in terms of its scope, what it's looking at and what it is concerned with. I'm distinguishing theory from criticism, and in doing so, what I'm suggesting is that criticism usually has as its focus, as its goal, trying to make better sense out of something. A review of a movie in the newspaper, an article that you've read about a poem or a book, some sort of assessment of a building and its architecture. That's criticism. It's trying to give people who care about that thing something new to think about or a better way of understanding it. Whereas theory will often take those artifacts, those things, as its subject, but rather uses them as a jumping off point to think about broader, more expansive, more ambitious conclusions that aren't limited to the thing. So you could read a piece of theory that's about a single poem, but it's not just of interest to people who care about that poem, but it's of interest to people who care about whatever sort of ideas that theoretical text will address or index or try to explore. And again, it could be a literary or artistic concept. It could be something about style or genre, and it also could be about politics and ideology, and sometimes all of them. I think that the reputation that theory has is sometimes negative, and it's often dismissed as something that's not very practical. The language in it, the ideas in it are often abstract, and that has to do with the ways in which the tradition of theory, of critical theory especially, is based in the philosophy that emerged in the 19th century in Europe. Hegel, Kant, we can talk about this if you want to. I have a pretty sketchy understanding of it, enough to make my way through a graduate program and enough to tell you a little bit about it. But I also don't want to get too bogged down in it because this could be a whole class just to read that 19th century stuff. But it is philosophical. And I mentioned that just to prepare you for reading some material that might seem as though it's written in a different discipline than what you might be used to. But rather than find that intimidating, I hope that we can find that empowering because, like philosophy, theory is engaged with how people make sense of their world. What differentiates theory from philosophy, I think, is its focus on art and politics. philosophy, and I'm speaking really broadly here, and if anyone is more trained in philosophy than I am, you might get offended by this, and I apologize for that. But philosophy is oftentimes really concerned with the mind and talking to other philosophers. Theory wants to help us make better sense out of our world in which we live in, and it recognizes that we're not always living in the world of the mind all the time. So if Kant and Hegel are interested in some spiritual ideal, theory might write about McDonald's. It might write about drag. It might write about things that philosophers might say that has nothing to do with philosophy, but theorists will say, if our goal is to make sense of our world, why are we not paying attention to the wrapping of a McDonald's cheeseburger, or the way that people in the Bronx in the 70s were dressing? And so I mentioned that to say that there are ways to get into theory if you haven't been trained in philosophy, as I haven't, and I think a lot of us, because philosophy classes aren't, the most popular classes in an institution. All this is to say is that if you haven't taken philosophy classes, you can still get a lot out of theory. But it is hard. It's hard to read. And it's hard to make sense of, but the difficulty, as we'll talk about in a second, is part of the process. Because we're learning about new ways of thinking, of seeing the world. I've linked here to an essay that I'm not going to go into in a whole lot of depth right now, but if you're interested in this, I encourage you to read it, from a professor at Pomona in California, Kila Wazana Tompkins. She writes on 19th century American literature, criticism, and theory. And she says that when we read theory, we aren't here to learn what we already know. And by that, she means that the process of reading theory breaks us out of the familiar. It confronts us with what we have not been confronted with before. And that is necessarily going to be challenging. It's not just learning new things, but it's learning new ways of thinking, new ways of reading. And so we'll talk about this in a little bit greater depth in a minute, but I mention this now to say that I don't expect anyone to fully master this material. Nobody really does. But what matters is you're engaging with it, and then you're taking something out of it that you can use and do thinking of your own with it. And by that I mean we're going to try to be theorizing alongside these works. But I'll have more to say about that in a second. I want to pause here though and hear what you all think about, or not you all, I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot here, but if anyone has thoughts about this, based either on experiences with theory that you've had in other contexts, or you're thinking about these ideas that I've just expressed, what's been prompted, what kind of ruminations or thinking you have based on these ideas that I've been talking about for the last 10 minutes.
Can you hear me, Mr. Finley?
Yes, please, go ahead. Thanks for
Uh,
jumping in.
Hi, everybody. Um, I, as Mr. Finley was discussing the distinction between theory and criticism, which was new to me, honestly, the first thing that came to mind was the literary theory course I took as an undergraduate, and I remember one of the schools of thought was new criticism, and the only thing that I remember about that particular brand of theory or lens was just focus on the text. Just focus on the text. So it kind of I don't know if it clashes with the distinction between theory and criticism, or if um, I guess my question is, why is new criticism only, does that only focus on the text? And if it does, why is it considered a theory or a lens?
Thanks, that's a great question. New criticism is considered a theory because even though it does focus only on the text, it's also interested in broader questions beyond just an individual text. So
Mhm.
for instance, the new critics were really into romantic poetry. And they would look at a sonnet not just to make sense of it itself, but to make sense of sonnets as a category, and to make sense of, or to try to answer the question, what makes a beautiful poem? So what is beauty? What is metaphor? What is mimesis? They're trying to understand these concepts and these categories. So it wasn't just about Ode to a Grecian Urn, a famous poem. At the same time, though, what we're going to do in this class and the kind of theory that we're going to read is going to be dramatically different than new criticism. And I appreciate your bringing it up, how the criteria that I delineated just then seems to have very little in common with this idea of just focusing on the text. And so I mentioned that because new criticism was, in certain ways, a reaction against the growing interest in critical theory that people had. People wanted to talk about politics. People wanted to talk about pop culture and everyday life. And there was a group of elite thinkers and critics who didn't like that. And so their move to say, no, we're just going to focus on the text, was a way of affirming their own power and their own authority. And so that happened in, I think, the 30s and the 40s. They're also obsessed with modernism. That's what I meant to say.
Yeah.
Not so much romanticism. But anyway, there aren't very many people who do criticism or theory, or who teach in humanities departments where a lot of theory is taught, who would think about themselves as new critics now. It's still taught as a sort of foundational element, and so I'm really glad that you brought it up. But again, I think what we're going to do is going to look very different than that. This is not to say that if any of you want to do new criticism, that you shouldn't do it. But it had its heyday, and it had its heyday for particular political reasons too. Other thoughts about that, Matthew, or anyone else about this specifically, before we go back to more general thoughts, please.
You hear me, sir?
Sorry, I pointed at my screen and I realized no one knows who I'm pointing at. It's gonna take me a little while to get used to this. This is my first time doing synchronous online teaching. Anyway, please go ahead.
Okay, sir. I would like to add something about that. I definitely agree with Matthew's concept or question. As far as I know about the theory is something like a concept or a set of rules or principles to be followed with certain activities, or sometimes based on activity as well. It could be wrong as well. For example, the Darwin theory, we remember that the evolution theory of Darwin, that's a pretty famous one. So later on, it proved to be wrong as well. So, and criticism, as far as I know, because I'm pretty much interested in literary studies. So what I learned about, it's kind of parameters, the criticism in which we put those theories or different philosophies, the critiques or the people they call critics, so they criticize, or sometimes they appreciate that as well. Like T.S. Eliot, he talked much about Shakespeare, but at the end of the day, or at the end, he just said like, nothing is there to be proved wrong about him, but he's a man with different qualities, or he has the capability to be a playwright. So I don't know, I may be wrong, or I might be wrong, but that's what I learned about the theory and the criticism.
Thanks. These are fantastic points, and I really appreciate how you brought up a different discipline and thinking about Darwin, because I would imagine that every discipline has theory to it, and so I think that this very broad idea of theory is helpful because it has to do with the rules for making sense of what the discipline looks at. It's a way of organizing knowledge, and those rules will change, and they will be challenged and replaced with new ways of thinking, because theory is quite dynamic in that regard. And so on the one hand, we have an impossible task in this class. Like, are we going to try to cover everything? Because that's going to give us whiplash. We're going to be going back and forth. We're going to get burned out. And I've taught a theory class like that before, and I found it kind of unsatisfying. So on the other hand, what I'm trying to make clear throughout the course of the semester is that learning theory is about also putting in your own ideas. It's not just learning something that's fixed and set in stone, right? But it's something that's dynamic and changing, and as such has space for more thinkers and actors and people to join in it. Anyway, thanks again for that as well. Other thoughts, please? Yep, please, Anne.
Annie.
Annie, thank you.
Hello, nice to meet you. I think of theory as a little thorn in my side, if you will, because it is a kaleidoscope. I guess if I can compare it that way, because there's so many different little perspectives and ideas based on well-educated, well-researched, either individuals or work in general, and written or produced or, I don't know, shown in a particular viewpoint. And it is criticism, but it's through their perspective. And I think I read the reading, A Bad Writer Writes Back, and one thing that kind of stuck out to me was whoever either creates or comes up with whatever concept that they're trying to present to their reader, well, it's their perspective. And as a reader, we either agree, disagree, or turn off both of those and dive deeper into what the presenter or the author is trying to convey. And what I find about theory is it could really infuriate people, because especially rule followers, because I'm a rule follower. And who says it needs to be that way, or that your perspective is correct? And so that's why I call it like a kaleidoscope, because through discussion and discourse, your little theory can change a little bit. And I think that that's what it's intended to do. I think that we need to place value where it's due, and take what we feel will work best with what our message might be. So that's kind of how I, in my mind, vision my definition of theory.
Thanks. That, like the other two comments, was really rich and helpful. And I said a few minutes ago that I'm not going to ask you to define your own or come up with your own definition of theory, but the ones we've had so far have been really rich. And so I'm grateful for that. And I love how you're talking about the personal use of it, and like what we do with theory in reading it, because we don't just read to make sense of it. We read and respond to it almost instinctively. Like, I agree with this, I disagree with that. And you mapped out that schematic, right? Like, some people accept it, some people don't. And I think that there's a third element too, and I think you were getting at this toward the end of your comments with this idea of what we do with it personally, is that even if we agree or disagree, there might be something in this piece that sparks thinking of our own, that helps us make sense of something else that we're interested in. So I might be reading this theoretical piece that's about sonnets, and it helps me make sense out of my interest in, I don't know what, like video games or movie posters or something, right? And that's part of the work we do, is we try to translate it into other contexts. But one of the things I like about the material here is that it is a set of rules. Like, these are the rules for genre. This is the rules for this, that, that. But it's not just a list of rules. It's not, and this is again because I'm spending a lot of time with a 5-year-old, it's not what you see at the playground. Like, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Because what my 5-year-old wants to do is argue with every single one of those rules, right? Like, why can't we run? Why are you not supposed to wear a helmet on the swings, right? What we're going to do is read stuff that has its rules, but it also tries to, on the one hand, justify those rules and show us why they matter. And by justify, I mean explain why they think it's right. And so there's a lot of material that we have to make our way through to try to fully understand the rules. But as I said a few minutes ago, we don't need to have mastery over this material. We don't need to understand every single element of a piece and how it all fits together. What we need to focus on, to Annie's point, is what do we think about it? How can we use it if it is useful to us in any way? I think it might be helpful to move on for now. I want to talk about a strand of theory, and it'll be somewhat repetitive because I didn't anticipate such, as I said, rich comments right off the bat. But I think it'll also be a chance for us to think more about what we're doing in investing time and energy in reading and discussing and writing about this material. I'm going to pull up the syllabus now. Just one second, please. Microsoft Word always has a hard time coming up for me here. This is the syllabus that I have posted to Blackboard. And if you haven't yet, I would encourage you to download it and save it in whatever form you would like and access it. I will change it most likely at some point or multiple points during the semester as things happen, but I will of course keep you updated and let you know that about those changes. In describing this course, I talk about it as an introduction to contemporary critical theory and as a means of practicing its methods. Critical theory, as I explained, has to do with philosophy. As I mentioned a little while ago, it has elements of literary criticism. It's interested in aesthetics, just to do with the philosophy of art and beauty. But it also draws upon sometimes social sciences, so sociology, gender and women's studies, other disciplines. And it's very much invested, as I said, in politics and ideology and culture. And so what it tries to do, and I'm thinking specifically about critical theory here as a strand of theory that developed in Europe in the 1940s and 50s, it's really trying to make sense out of culture and power and how those two categories work together. Critical theory takes culture very seriously. Sometimes some would say too seriously. It does not subscribe to the belief that culture is just for entertainment or diversion. It certainly is, but it also has much more to reveal if you look at it closely. So again, critical theory can look at labeling at McDonald's. It can look at cartoons. It can take these things that are often dismissed as not very serious or not very intellectual as revealing a whole lot if you look at it carefully. Now, it's oftentimes invested in what's called critique, and this is not evaluation strictly. It's not like this is good, this is bad, this is successful, but rather using an object as an opportunity for commentary. And it's commentary that will tell us about the object itself, but also about other things. And one of the things that I find really interesting about theory is the way in which it can pivot from one thing to something that's seemingly unrelated. But again, because it's not a set of rules, it spends time trying to articulate and weave together connections that you wouldn't see otherwise. As I've been saying, it's not only about literature, it's not only about art, but can look at a lot of other topics that sometimes fall outside of the bounds of literary studies. And it's ultimately invested in how knowledge, identity, culture, politics, nature make meaning and how we make meaning through them. These are just some of the terms that come up a lot, but this is not an exhaustive list. It's not all that it writes about. And so critical theory is also critical because it doesn't just try to make sense out of the world, it's also a little bit critical of it, and it tries to change the world. It changes our ways of thinking about it, and it seeks to bring about new ways of thinking, new ways of being in relation to one another. It has a somewhat utopian goal to it of trying to create something that hasn't been in existence yet. And it takes seriously the idea that art and culture and expression are the tools to do so. That art and culture and expression have always shaped our world, and that if we as people understand how art and culture shape us, we can free ourselves from the ways in which people in power and and forces of repression have controlled us. So it's got a liberatory and emancipatory element. I mentioned that it started in the 1940s in Europe because, in large part, critics recognized how the Nazis came to power by ways of manipulating culture and knowledge making. And the Nazis got a lot of people to go on board with their genocidal project by manipulating and using art and culture and ideology. And people wanted to make sense of that. Like, how did the Holocaust happen in the modern world? So we're not going to read those critics in this class. If you want to think more about this, if this is interesting to you, you can use the assignments in this class to read more of that material, and I've got a lot of resources that I can share with you about it. But what we'll do is we'll start with some influential pieces of particularly recent critical theory, stuff that's been written in the last decade or two, and think about not just what they say, but how they make their claims. So we're going to focus on method as well. And by that, I mean, we're going to read this theory as you would in another English class. We're going to analyze it, right? It's not just about what it says, but also how does it go about making its argument? So as I said before, I find reading theory challenging. And my way to make sense of it is to do what I do with any text that is hard, is to look at a passage and try to make sense of it and close read it and do the stuff that we do in an English class when we're looking at a poem. And so finally, what this is going to lead to is where you are doing some theoretical work, whether that's writing or something else. So putting this in conversation with what we were saying a few minutes ago and with the points about theory in general, what do you want to add to this? What are the gaps that you're noticing in this definition that I've given? What does this prompt in terms of your own thinking or ideas? What can you share with us about this? And I'll just say too, for those of you who haven't had a class with me before, I have a tendency of saying multiple questions at the same time. And, and I do that in part because I want to approach a question in multiple ways. And my hope is that one of those questions will prompt something among the disparate group of people who come together in a class. But I also do it and like to have a pause afterwards, like, whoa, that was a lot. And so the pause is less awkward that way, but the pause is good because it gives people time to catch their breath and think. And so please don't just jump in right away. I mean, if you've got an idea, don't sit on it, because if you're anything like me, you'll forget the idea. But at the same time, don't think that I'm one of those teachers who doesn't like quiet. You might think it's awkward for me if no one says anything, but I like to think that it's a good sign that people are thinking and creating and processing. You might be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. That's okay. But even if you're thinking about that, you still might have an idea that jumps in. So with that, I will shut up for a minute and open it up to anyone who wants to add more to what we've been saying. Yes, please, Ashley.
Hi, Dr. Finley. Nice to meet you. I guess I don't know that you necessarily missed anything, but I just wanted to say kind of what my idea of critical theory is, just based on my experiences, which isn't a lot, but it's a little bit. And it's kind of similar to like what Annie was saying. When I think of critical theory, I think of perspectives, like different perspectives that you go into when reading a work or looking at a piece of art or interpreting anything really. You know, like you can go into a movie watching it from a feminist perspective and thinking about like the Bechdel test and, oh, the movie doesn't fit that, so it's not a good movie. Whereas that could be someone else's favorite movie because they're looking at it from a different perspective, whether it's a, you know, precise theoretical like way to look at it, or it's just their own, for their own enjoyment, what they want out of a movie, you know. So that's kind of how I think of theory.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful. I love the idea of perspective. And perspective has to do with vision and sight, but it also, as you're suggesting, has to do with thinking and making sense. And each piece of theory is going to be its own perspective, but it's also helpful to think about it in terms of meta perspectives. Like, is this a feminist perspective? Like, there are obviously a variety of perspectives within it, but it's one category and way of making sense of that. I also like the way that you use the Bechdel test. And for those who don't know, the Bechdel test, and please, Ashley, Ashley, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Bechdel test is that a movie passes the Bechdel test if two women characters talk about something to each other that does not have to do with men or heterosexual relations, right? And so that is a phrase, it's a keyword, it's a concept that, as we just saw with Ashley's point, people can take and use in different contexts for making meaning about a film in this case, like does this pass the Bechdel test or not, but also much more expansively making sense of other things like the misogyny in Hollywood, the, you know, and you can spin it out. And that's what people do when they read and respond and use theory. So you just modeled that really effectively. And you could read something that's 20 pages long and it's really confusing you, but if there's one phrase in there that's helpful, and you can take it and it's portable, you can translate it elsewhere, you've done everything you need to do, right? Like the Bechdel test. I got it. I'm going to take it. And I don't know where it originated, but I would imagine there were other things in it. Like, you don't need to worry about that too much if it's not helpful to you, right? Take what you need, use it, make meaning, pass it on. So anyway, that was great. Thanks. Other thoughts about this, about other, yeah, please, Jesse.
Yeah, so I've been kind of quiet because I'm trying to process and digest a little bit. I did take a undergraduate course with Dr. Bridgman that was Introduction to Critical Theory, and I think that was a very critical theory for me is just really challenging. And I think that that was one of the hardest classes that I've ever taken. And throughout the semester, during that class, I was like, man, am I just is my brain not working? Because it was quite a lot to understand and wrap my head around. And I oftentimes had to pull one of my friends and be like, "Can you read this? Can you try to help me like understand what's going on in this passage or this particular part?" And so for me, I had to think out loud quite a bit and kind of hand it to someone else that has no idea, what this is, to see their viewpoint and what they got from it, because sometimes I was completely off. I would come to class and I was thinking one thing and it was just way on the other end of the world from where from what the philosopher, the theorist was actually trying to get across. So for me, theory is really, really complicated, and it takes a lot for me to like process it, and I have to think out loud. And so I'm looking forward to tackling it again and seeing if I can, wrap my head around these bigger concepts, because for me, it's really challenging. So
Thanks for admitting to that. I appreciate that because
Yeah.
I'll do it the same. It's really challenging for me too. But I don't necessarily think that that should discourage us, even though that is discouraging when it happens. And so I mentioned this, and I appreciate you saying that, and I just want to reiterate it. So if you find yourself getting discouraged, just remember what we're talking about here. I think it's a sign that you are doing new sorts of thinking that you haven't done before. And in many ways, like that's what we're here to do with this class, but also with an English studies degree, the humanities in general. We're not trying to learn a theory in physics or an equation in chemistry where if you don't get it right, the bridge will collapse or the beaker will blow up. We're trying to break out of, in the spirit of the critical theorists who got this started, we're trying to break out of commonsensical ideas, the way we've always been thinking. And that is necessarily going to be challenging and frustrating. And that's a sign of its success. So many times when we're in school, you think, I don't get this, that's a problem. In this class, not getting it is a good thing. And so it's going to take a little bit of a different approach to that. Let me pull up an essay that I shared. And I heard, I think Annie mentioned that you read it before, but this was not assigned and it's not, oh, it's not even, okay, let me show you where the readings are if you haven't yet under course content. Oh, never mind, I know where it is. Okay, do you see this PDF a bad writer writes back? Great, thanks. This is a letter to the editor of the New York Times by Judith Butler, who is a theorist. She teaches at the University of California, Berkeley. And she is notorious for writing in language that makes your head hurt. And so she's responding to that criticism here. But she's saying in a sense that theory has to do that. It has to be challenging to read because what it's trying to do is question common sense, interrogate the tacit presumptions, the unstated rules of everyday life, and provoke new ways of looking at a familiar world. The familiar is comfortable in a lot of ways. The familiar is what we're used to, and breaking out of it is going to require some sort of uncomfort, some sort of discomfort, some sort of pain, she's suggesting. She also writes, and this is something I mentioned a minute ago about trying to bring about a new world. But what really hits me about this piece and why I wanted to talk about it a little bit today is why you can't just say what you want to say and move it on through, right? Why can't a piece of theory be like the rules at the playground? The person she's imagined who's responding to the criticism that their writing is obtuse, challenging, says, if what he says could be said in ordinary language, he probably would have done so in the first place, right? They're not trying to be difficult. Even Judith Butler, and I had her on the syllabus, but I took it off at the last minute, and you can thank me. You can thank me later for doing that because it's tough. But what we're trying to make sense of are things that we haven't yet understood and that not many people stop to think about. Why the world works the way it does, why power operates the way it does, why art works the way it does. And so in order to do so, we need unordinary language. And it's going to be hard. But in reading it, just like doing a challenging exercise in your sports practice, or if you're a musician trying to get your muscle memory built up, the process is what matters here. There are no quizzes or exams in this class. Sorry, someone in the other room is shouting. You don't need to master this and say, like, this is what this essay is about. in one sentence, done. Because that's not really possible. And again, part of what we're trying to do here is practice reading this material because it helps us think in new and different ways. So if you ever feel yourself getting discouraged, please recall this moment. Please go back to that Judith Butler essay and tell yourself it's a sign that I'm on the right track here. And then we'll come together in what I hope will be a space that is open to questions and expressions of frustration. And we'll collectively try to make better sense out of it, both to understand what the piece says, but also getting back to Annie's point about taking it and adding your own personal element to it. And Ashley's example of applying it, we'll just try to do something with it. We don't need to understand everything about it in order to take something that we can use. So with that, I want to share some suggestions, some tips for how to, actually no, my notes are all mixed up here. Let's take a break from this talking about theory and just talk a little bit more about who we are and what we're trying to do here in this class. And so what I'd like to do is give you a few minutes to come up with some things to share. These are suggestions of what you could share for this introductory section. And this could be with regard to interests and goals. It could be academic, scholarly, intellectual, teaching. It could be something entirely unrelated to that. And because, as we were saying a few minutes ago, dialogue and sharing and responding to other people can be really helpful, please think about whether there's something that we can do as a group to help you meet those goals. So I'll just talk a little bit about my own responses to these while you're gathering your thoughts, and then we'll hear from everyone else. My name is James Finley. My pronouns are he and him. I go by Dr. Finley or Professor Finley, please. And my interests and goals academically and as a teacher are, on the one hand, to help students gain a better understanding of early and 19th century American literature. That's the area in which I usually teach. Excuse me. Excuse me. My scholarship, the book that I'm working on, focuses on the anti-slavery movement in the 1840s and 1850s. I'm interested in how people were writing about the environment. Sorry. Yeah, I thought I was muting myself. Anyway, I'm writing about the environment and race in the abolitionist movement, and I also oversee our teacher certification program for English majors who are getting their teaching degree. I was a high school teacher before grad school. I've been in San Antonio for a little over 8 years now. I'm from the Northeast originally. I moved here from Maine. I still look like I live in Maine. And I really love the city and this community. I love being at A&M, and the chance to work with the students, undergraduate and graduate students, is the highlight of my job. I think you all are so brilliant, and I always learn from the students in my class, so I'm really excited about that. Anything that you can do to support me, don't get discouraged about this. Let me know how I can help. I know it sounds weird to say that that's a way you can support me, but just please communicate and let me know. Anything else that you should know? I don't think so, but if you've got questions, let me know. So with that, so we can see each other a little better. I'm just gonna go clockwise in the order that I have on my screen. And please do correct me if I'm not pronouncing your name right, or if you go by another name than what's on the screen. But anyway, Desiree,
All right. Hi, everyone. So my name is Desiree Brown. I go by Des or Desi as well. This is my second semester in grad school. I did recently graduate my undergrad from Texas A&M San Antonio with my teaching certificate. I'm a baby teacher this year. I teach ninth grade at CASTEM. That's in Southwest ISD. And so it's been quite the journey navigating through COVID times and migrating to online teaching and things of that nature. So I'm really excited for the semester. My pronouns are she and her. A way to help me is that I tend to talk to myself a lot and having to talk things out. I'm a pen and paper person. So I'm like scrabbling and things like that. So like I said earlier, critical theory is something that's really challenging for me, and I tend to get frustrated sometimes if I'm kind of overloaded. So definitely if I'm quiet, I'm like processing, like I'm here, but I'm just processing and making my way through the content. So it's nice to see all you guys again. I think we were all in the same class last semester almost. So it's great to see everybody.
Okay, nice, thanks. I hope it's not redundant to do this. It's really helpful for me. But anyway, Desi, it's great to see you again, and let's talk about how your teaching's going sometime. I'm
Yes,
dying to know how
for
it's
sure.
going. I'm sure you're doing great.
Yeah, and helping me pass that exam, Dr. Finley, with your reviews, like you're the bomb.
Oh, that exam. If I had
I
one
know.
wish, if I had a magic wand, getting rid of that exam is the first thing I would do.
Yes.
Anyway, thanks. Welcome, Desi. Abrar, is that right? We can't hear you. I'm sorry. You're muted.
I'll send them a chat message. See.
Okay. Thanks.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
My name is Abrar Khan, and as Desiree mentioned, it's pretty much the same class. And the only person I wanted to see him like that was Matthew Gonzalez. I usually used to read his post with Dr. Ayers, so that was the only person I saw. Me myself, I'm a teaching assistant at Northside ISD. Sometimes John Marshall, and most of the time Holmes High School. So here to get my certification, the graduate degree, and trying to become a ESL regular teacher. So that's about me. And theory is for me. So I love theoretical work and theories, and I get them very quickly. Like if you talk in a minute, so I'll definitely after a short break, you can ask me, I'll tell you everything. And sometimes my own mind starts working with that. So I love theories. I'm not a guy with a mathematical work or a 2 and 2 is equal to 4, so I'm not good with those things. So me and Desiree, we are pretty much opposite to each other. But anyways, I love the way she talked. So nice meeting you, sir. And I love that so far because the way you are explaining everything and what is theory. These are pretty much common things, but it's not common. The factors, the things you just mentioned in that, I love that because we didn't think about in that way, like the way you explained. So I really appreciate that. And it's a mutual cooperation. We always work with each other, so teachers, students. So I love that, by the way. Thank you very much, everyone. Matthew, nice to meet you, brother.
Thanks very much. Welcome, Abrar. Matthew, please.
Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Gonzalez. This is my third semester as a graduate student. I'm only taking one course per semester, so I'm just kind of moving like a snail through everything because I work full time. So this is my first theory course, probably in a long time. The only C I got as an undergraduate was in literary theory. So it's the dragon that I have to slay, I think. I don't know. But yeah, it's interesting what Annie said about theory, how it seems to kind of, I don't know, contradict itself, where it's like it's a set of rules, but then it's also, you know, my set of rules are more effective than yours. And so I couldn't really get a grasp on theory, but I have a feeling that I'm a little bit more up to the challenge this time around. But as far as my interest as a student, post-colonial studies, particularly uh, within science fiction, colonial study of colonialism within science fiction literature. I like science fiction literature as a literature of ideas. It's been written by authors from different backgrounds all over the world. So I think it's often overlooked as a very valuable genre of literature. So that's
Thanks, Matthew. Welcome. What you were saying about sci-fi really resonated with me, because even the most pulpy sci-fi is theorizing, right? Like it's
Yeah.
imagining different worlds,
Mhm.
right? And it's always concerned with politics. And so, yeah, I think you'll have
Right.
a lot to take to your sci-fi interests with that as well. Anyway, thanks again. Annie, please.
Hello again. I think most people in the group, except for you, Dr. Finley, know my writing and my passion when I write, because I get really heated about certain topics, and especially I know how much I'm going to love this class, because I am the why girl. My entire life, I'm like, well, why did it do that? Well, I don't even understand. Tell me, show me. I always want to see the other person. I guess it's a true Gemini in me. I want to see the other person's perspective, because I have to understand it. I may not agree with you, but there's absolutely no way that I will be able to comprehend it 100% if I don't understand your perspective, your viewpoint, not necessarily the words on a page, but why in the world are you thinking that way? And last semester, they witnessed me transform some of my traditional beliefs about writing and the English language and things like that. So I'm in my second year of graduate school. I will fulfill my dream, my 10-year-old little girl's dream of receiving a PhD and teaching at a university level. It will happen. I might be 95 and toothless, but it is going to happen. I come from a long line of people who have to persevere. In other words, we don't do things the easy way ever. Therefore, I teach full-time middle school, and I'm taking 9 hours graduate studies. I did that last semester. So I thought, well, why not? Let's do it again. Here I am. I always need help. I'm always the first person to say, hey, I always throw myself under the bus, because I don't want I show myself as being vulnerable, so that will make it comfortable for other people, as well as I am here to learn. Therefore, I have a ton of questions, and I will need help calming down. I will get passionate about certain things. And there's several times that Ashley had calmed me down yesterday about a different class. She's like, take a deep breath. It's going to be fine. Just because I was like, I don't want to write about this, So, and it's interesting, because then I wrote about it today and I was like, ooh, oh my gosh, where did that come from? So again, person that does things the hard way sometimes has to go through trudging through mud in order to get to the other side. And that's kind of the person that I am. I think I answered most questions. I prefer Annie.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Annie. It's great to hear about your curiosity and your enthusiasm for questions and writing and teaching. It's going to add a lot to the class, I think. So welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ashley, please.
Yeah, I'm Ashley. I use she, her pronouns. I'm just taking 2 classes. I mean, 2 classes is a lot, but I'm not doing a lot of other things because I wanted to not be stressed out. I get really stressed out really easily. So I was like, lower the stress. I am working with Doctors Tinoco and Eddie on their research program. Program, it's not a program, it's a project. That's the word. And my goal is to eventually get my PhD. I'm looking at different schools, UT Austin, some schools in Dallas and Carnegie Mellon. That one's just thrown in there for fun. But yeah, let's see. I'm excited for this class because actually one of the reasons I'm in graduate school is from my bachelor's degree. I took a literary criticism class, and the professor told us like this class is kind of the closest you're going to get to a graduate type class. And I just like had so much fun in the class. I don't know, like you're right, it pushes you really hard in ways that you've never thought before. And I just really enjoyed that experience. And so I was like, okay, yeah, like I can do graduate school, because I kind of had no idea like what it would be before that. And so, yeah, I'm excited for that. I guess some things about me. I don't know if you can tell from my headset. My husband gave this to me. The computer I'm on, he built for me because he wanted me to play video games with him. So I've been playing some video games recently. I'm not very good, but he was like, I want you to play with me. And I was like, okay, fine. Give me all the stuff and I'll do it. So that's been fun. It's been good because with quarantine, we get to talk to friends and hang out with them essentially without having to actually be in person. So that's been helping our mental states a lot, I think. I also like reading. I read like 20 books over break, maybe 15. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. I was like reading all I could. And I like playing the guitar too and writing songs. I'm not particularly amazing at it, but I'm okay and I enjoy it. So things for the class that might be good to know about me. I prefer, especially with online classes, like hard due dates. I know like, and I know other people don't like that. So, but for me personally, that helps me stay on track and not like get everything piling up on top of me. So, yeah, hard due dates, I really like those. And then I also, March is going to be kind of a hectic month, I know already. My cousin hired me to babysit for a week, and then we're also going to be moving during that month. So there's going to be a lot of stuff happening. And yeah, I'm excited. It's a little intro to me.
Thanks so much. Welcome. We don't have a ton of time left. We have 8 minutes, so I'll actually start talking about assignments and due dates in a second. The good news is that we do have hard due dates in this class because the assignments are going to build off of one another. At the same time, though, I am more than willing to be flexible when folks need it. So we'll talk about what those due dates are. They're on the syllabus, but if you are moving, if you are babysitting, if something happens unexpectedly, we can move things around to fit your schedule, because I know that you will want to do this work, or at least be committed to doing this work and complete it. And if we need to take a little more time or move things around, that's fine. I hope that you all will let me know if there are other ways, if things come up, if you didn't think about it or didn't mention it for whatever reason, that I can be supportive. You can send me an email. We can meet. Let me get back to the syllabus because, as I said, we don't have a ton of time left. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about the assignments because we'll have much more time to do it. But the one thing I'll mention is that the next assignment is that whenever we have reading due, which is next week and for the next month, I'd like you to share your notes with us. I'm not asking you to post on a discussion board. I'm not asking you to write a blog or a reflection. I just want to have something that you share with us. This can look like whatever you want it to look like. It can be a paragraph of a reaction or a reflection, a Word document that you upload. It could be marks in the margin of a page, if you print it out, of a passage that was really important to you. I just want us to have something that we can see and that you can talk us through when we meet. Because the abstract nature of some of this work means that if we don't have something that we can look at, if we don't have something that grounds us, our discussion is going to be hard to make sense of. It's going to be even more abstract, right? So what this looks like is up to you. And I would encourage you to check in with me if you are concerned about what you're going to submit. But you can also just go ahead and submit whatever you want. Again, it could be something handwritten, it could be an outline, it could be free writing about it. It could be thinking about it in another context entirely. I'll send you a link to the Google Drive later, and that way you can upload it. And I'm using that rather than Blackboard so that you can have different forms. It can be a picture. You just like take a picture of your notebook. You take a picture of the page. It could be a Word document. It could be something else. Does that make sense? Are there questions about that? Concerns folks have about that?
Dr. Finley, will it be in the Google Drive? Will it be obviously labeled as such, reading number 2 or reading
Yeah,
number?
it'll be organized by week.
Okay.
It'll be week 2 for next week 3, and you can just upload it that way. And I don't have a strict deadline for this because I realize that sometimes people might not be able to get to it. You know, I want to be sensitive to the multiple ways in which the pandemic has upended people's lives. People are out of work. People are working way more than they had planned to. People are caring for kids, for parents. You know, unexpected things come up. And so I don't have a deadline for this, but if you can submit it before class, it'll give me a chance to look over it briefly. And that way I can pull it up when we're meeting and you can say, oh, I wanted to talk about this passage and here are my notes. I'm going to explain them to you as we go through. Other thoughts, other questions about this?
So next week, we're going to be submitting notes for Audre Lorde and Barbara Christian or Butler.
You can, oh man, I already noticed the typo. I'll fix this. But in the weeks when there is more than one reading, you can upload notes on just one of them.
Okay.
If you want to do both of them, that's fine. But if you just, again, if there's a passage in one of them and you just want to annotate it, take a picture of it, upload it. That's all you need to do.
Okay.
Thank you.
So for
Other
next
thoughts?
week,
Please.
we can choose to focus on Butler or Lorde or Christian.
To be honest, I'd rather you focus on Lorde or Christians.
Okay.
Lords or Christians pieces. The Butler was more just to get us started today. Although if you really want to write about Butler and talk about it, then feel free to do so. But I would just as soon move on. And these two pieces I wanted us to start with because they both are about theory itself and why theory matters. They're not so much in the way that some of the later readings will be specific examples of a particular kind of theory. And they're relatively short. I cut a lot of the readings from the last time I offered this course. And I'll put these slides up in a little bit, but I have here, I did a bad job of keeping track of time. I have some tips for reading theory. And one of them is to read the piece at least twice and maybe even 3 times. Because the first time we read it, we're trying to make sense out of big picture stuff. We're trying to get a sense of where it is and what's happening. The second time we're reading it in different ways. And the third time we have a much better sense of it. I have more specific suggestions in here, that we'll talk about next time will model some of these. And some of these things I've already talked about. Don't aim for mastery, for instance. Don't try to understand, or don't feel as though you need to understand everything. But my takeaway, or what I'd like you to take away from this right now, is that I expect you to read these pieces multiple times, which is why you'll see certain weeks that there's 24 pages of reading. I'm not one of those professors who thinks that a grad class needs to have a ton of reading, but I also know that it is a grad class and we do expect a lot of work, essentially. And so what I hope is that even though I've cut down the readings because of the multiple ways that the pandemic is making life challenging, I also hope you'll have time to read these essays 3 times. Thoughts about that? Questions about that? I'll be sending you an invitation to the Google Drive. If you've got issues uploading it or any problems at all, just send me anything and then I'll put it up. The other assignments are going to mostly go up to Blackboard, and those aren't due for a while, so I'm not going to talk about them right now since we're pretty much out of time. But all I'm asking you to do for next week is to read those 2 pieces, upload your notes or submit them to me and I'll upload them, and be prepared to think in collaboration with us when we come together at this time next week. I'll mention too that I'm sorry I just have to scroll here. It's really hard for me to watch someone scroll when they're sharing their screen. I am available to meet on Monday, Wednesday, Friday afternoons from 12:30 to 3:30 by Zoom. And the best way to sign up is to go to my Calendly page. If those times don't work for you, let me know, especially those of you who have commitments that you know, like teaching, etc. I'm happy to meet with you at other times. Just let me know what your availability is, and I will work around your schedule. But those are the times that I've set aside. Please, if you can, take a minute to go over the other policies. Some of these are university policies. Some of these are my own. I'm sorry we didn't have a chance to get more into it, and I'll talk much more about the sequencing of the class as we go forward. But since we are a little bit over, is there anything else that is pressing right now that folks want to mention? Or a question? All right, well, thank you all for doing this again. I'm really excited. What you were sharing in our comments about theory and your introductions was super compelling, and I know I'm going to learn a lot from you and have a good time this semester. So thanks again for doing this. And I'll stick around for a couple minutes if folks have more questions, but otherwise I'll say goodbye. Good luck. My typical sign off in COVID times, and you'll get used to this, is to say that I hope you're taking care of yourself. It's really, really important. Don't fall into the thinking that like, oh, it's grad school. I need to burn myself out. You're doing no one a favor if you get tired of this halfway through the semester and you think, forget it. But take care of yourself. Take care of the people who you love, and ask them to take care of you too. We need that care in whatever form it takes in these times, especially with the numbers going up. And I hope that you can get a vaccine soon if you haven't gotten one yet. My parents in upstate New York got theirs yesterday, and I'm really excited about that because they're old and they have pre-existing conditions. But I'll keep my fingers crossed for you all for your vaccines. And again, I hope you're staying safe, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next week. So long. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.